Hi, my name is Paul Yoder. I am the NCTE CAEP SPA coordinator, and this is the first of what I hope to be as a series of video webinars for programs as they are preparing to write their program reports using the new NCTE standards. Those of you that have looked at the new standards, you can see that while the content of those standards is pretty much what we asked for from the previous set of standards, the new standards are framed quite a bit differently and provide a lot more flexibility to programs, which presents some good and some bad. The great point of those new standards is it's really now giving programs the flexibility that they've been asking for to demonstrate how well their candidates are being prepared in their teacher education programs. The previous set of standards were quite prescriptive in terms of what they were asking. They were asking for very specific things with lots of data points to them. And the positive of that kind of a review process is it's a very objective process. You have a very specific standard, you provide a data point for that standard, you talk about what that data point means, and then you move on. But at the same time, and we understand that the programs were a little bit frustrated because that almost defined curriculum for them. In a way that maybe wasn't as helpful as it could be. So the new standards now allow for this much greater freedom and flexibility, but at the same time there's a greater subjectiveness to the process, which can be a little bit scary, I think, for programs and for reviewers as well. How are we going to look at these new standards and make our determination? So what I'm hoping to accomplish in this video series that we'll be publishing throughout the beginning of this year is to provide more insight to programs of what it is exactly that reviewers are going to be looking for and the discussions that we're having as we look at the program reports. So this is not a process about you trying to guess what it is that we're looking for or what we want, but really giving you the opportunity to demonstrate what it is that's happening in your program. So that's what we would like to do with this first initial video, and we're going to go through these things relatively quickly, but basically to give you a grand overview of what your expectations are in terms of putting a program report together and what we as reviewers are going to be looking for now over the next 10 years that we're dealing with these new set of standards. So again, my contact information is on the screen. My name is Paul Yoder. You can reach me at the email and the phone number there. This is not my full-time job. My full-time job is as a professor of English education. So the best way to get hold of me if you have a question, and please, if you have questions, ask questions. That's the idea. The more work that we can do up front with programs, the less stressful it is for all of us on the other end. So again, we don't want you guessing at the process. That doesn't help anybody. So if you have a question, please feel free to get in touch with me. If I don't know the answer, I will get the answer to you. Email is probably the best way to get hold of me initially. And especially if you're just simply asking a question, I can get back to emails relatively quickly. If it's a little bit more complicated or you do want to have a phone conversation, I'm happy to talk things out on the phone, and you can reach me there as well. So let's talk a little bit about the review process, what we're going to be looking for as reviewers, and how things may have changed from the previous 10 years into the up and coming 10 years. Just very, very quickly, I want to touch on the decisions that we will be making overall. For each standard, we decide whether a standard is met, not met, or met with conditions. And then overall, in terms of the program, we don't accredit a program, we simply recognize a program, and we only make 3 decisions. We're either going to say your program is, we're recommending to CAEP that your program is recognized, it's recognized with conditions, or it's not nationally recognized. So the nationally recognized decision is the one that we all want. Means everything is in order, the date is there, there's no further action that you need to take except to go out and to celebrate that you got your national recognition, and we'll see you again in 7 years. The decision that's probably the most, I don't want to say controversial, but confused, is the nationally recognized with conditions. Nationally recognized with conditions is nationally recognized. Okay, you're great, good. There's some minor things, typically just very minor, that we need cleaned up. before we can say just fully nationally recognized and let you go for the next 7 years. And the reason that that's there is they're usually compliance kinds of things. You're missing an application of data. So as soon as you get the data, submit the data. We're not dinging your program or holding you negatively accountable just for that application of data. We know you're going to get it. It just needs to be there. Again, as a compliance issue as you go through CAEP unit accreditation, it has to be there. So we put a conditions on there. It doesn't mean that you have to revise or rewrite anything. Just submit the data when you have it. Sometimes, and this was especially true with the old set of standards, language on a rubric needed to be tweaked a little bit. To greater align to the specificity of those standards. Fine, just go back, make some subtle revisions to your rubrics, resubmit those rubrics, and the condition statement comes off. So a nationally recognized with conditions is a nationally recognized decision. It typically means there's nothing wrong with your assessment system. Your assessment system is fine. We just want to clean up any small problems now so 7 years down the road they don't explode into much larger kinds of issues. I explain to deans and to provosts all the time that, a condition is not a negative finding. A condition is just simply tidying up just a little bit. Where I pull my hair out and lose sleep is when programs get a condition statement for something relatively minor. Revise the language a little bit on this one particular rubric. It's the only condition, and then they come back and they say, well, we got conditions, so obviously we weren't doing something right, so we completely redid our entire assessment system. That's not what we're asking for in a nationally recognized with conditions. Not nationally recognized means that there's a larger issue at work and some substantial revision needs to be done. Typically, if you get that finding back and you don't understand why it's there, this is where we need to have a conversation, because there's some larger issues at play that need to be fixed here. So those are the three decisions. Nationally recognized with conditions, both of those are positive findings. And then not nationally recognized, depending on why it's not nationally recognized, could be some small things that need to be fixed, or it could be some larger kinds of things that need to be fixed. But those are the three decisions ultimately that we're going to be making. In our conversation today, nationally recognized and nationally recognized with conditions are probably the two that we're going to be talking about most, which is why I wanted to do that quick review. One more quick review is to talk about the required assessments, and I'm not going to spend a great deal of time with this because I am going to put out an additional video that talks about each one of these assessments when we have some example assessments coming in. We do have a handful of programs that have gone through under the new standards and are putting some really interesting kinds of assessments together. And as we get those over the course of this last cycle and this next coming cycle, I'd like to have a library of assessments to put up that you can take a look at. And when I put those model assessments up, I don't want to just throw the model assessments up, but I want to include a video to go along with them to kind of talk you through why they're model assessments. But just as a quick review for us today, and again, these haven't changed. Assessment 1 is a content knowledge assessment. So is Assessment 2. Assessment 1 is your state licensure exam. This is a compliance assessment in many ways. It's to show the 80% pass rate, which is a CAEP requirement that you have to demonstrate an 80% pass rate of your state licensure exam. State licensure exam praxis is the most common, tend to be very, very broad assessments and didn't show content knowledge very well on a standard by standard basis using the old set of standards. What you're going to find with the new set of standards are these broader assessments like the praxis and course grades, which most programs use for Assessment 2, which again, because they were so broad, they didn't show candidate mastery of the specific 3.0 standards from the old set of standards. With the new broader standards, these broader assessments can demonstrate candidate mastery of that content knowledge. So I think that's going to help quite a bit. But Assessment 2 typically were course grades. We've seen over the last couple of years programs using content portfolios more so than the course grades, or at least at some point maybe in the assessments 7 and 8, those wildcard slots, putting in some kind of a portfolio kind of assessment. That became really, really popular. But again, that's something we'll talk about at a later time. So assessments 1 and 2 haven't changed. Assessment 3 hasn't changed either. It is the pedagogical, professional knowledge, skills, and dispositions assessment. This is the assessment that basically shows that your candidates can plan lessons, that understand student learning, that kind of thing. We see these typically in methods kinds of courses. Assessment 4 is the application of that pedagogical knowledge, and this is the one that tripped up some programs, because this is the assessment that requires students to be in practice. So how are they employing the pedagogical knowledge that they have? So quite often this is going to be your student teaching assessment form. The other thing that sometimes trips up programs is they'll use a generic student teaching assessment form here, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. I know a lot of units want a generic form because it gives them comparative data across all of their programs, and this is especially useful as you go through the CAEP unit accreditation because it gives you some common data points. But for our purposes, we're not looking across all the programs. We're looking at ELA specific. That's really what we want to see. So one of the things that's proven quite useful, and it's something that I do recommend to programs, is if you have to use a generic form for your unit, could you include an addendum for ELA candidates? So you fill out the regular student teaching form, but then also there's this sub form, the smaller form that you're going to fill out just for your ELA candidates to give you some ELA specific data. And that proves to be very, very, very useful, because that way you're collecting the unit-wide data, but you're also collecting for the program review something very, very specific. And I know a number of the other SPAs encourage that as well, because you're getting that SPA-specific data. But that's Assessment 4. Assessment 4 has to be in an actual teaching, an authentic teaching situation. It can't be something that's developed in a methods course. Assessment 5, the effects on student learning. Typically, these are very good. These are quite often your teacher work sample kinds of things. And then Assessment 6 has been a little bit strange over the years. Assessment 6 was really kind of that disposition piece we were encouraging programs to. This was in the later stages of NCAEP, or the focus was really on teacher candidate dispositions. How are you assessing candidate dispositions? And this is where the candidate attitudes came out of this Assessment 6. And what a lot of programs came back here recently were telling us is, well, we build in dispositions throughout the assessment system. We don't really have a pull-out assessment that's specifically addressing candidate attitudes. That's something that we assess in places throughout the assessment system, and they explain that in their narrative, and they point to the particular assessments of where those candidate attitudes are being assessed in Assessment 3, and then again in Assessment 4 and Assessment 5 and so forth. So Assessment 6 has been a little bit of a wild card for us in that regard. If you're showing candidate attitudes in other places, we haven't been as holding programs as accountable to making Assessment 6 as specific to candidate attitudes as this would recommend. Now, other programs, yes, they use Assessment 6, and that is their candidate attitudes. They have a specific disposition assessments, and they put it rightfully so in Assessment 6, and that's great. But as we're beginning to see dispositions as more of a universal kind of data point that kind of goes throughout an entire program, not on a specific assessment. What you are going to find with the new standards, the one thing that's completely and totally different than anything we've ever done before, and we're very proud of it, is the social justice standard. And this is the one that programs, when I was originally talking about these standards to program, they really kind of embraced this and applauded it and said, yeah, this is great. We need to do this. We need to look at those elements of social justice. And then it suddenly sinks into their heads that, well, wait a minute, though, how are we going to assess that? Well, that's where Assessment 6 comes in. So I would encourage you to use that Assessment 6 piece, and reviewers are going to be looking at Assessment 6 as kind of that natural place now where we're going to put the social justice piece in to Assessment 6. So to begin thinking about how are you going to assess elements of social justice. Now, it could be that you are going to embed social justice throughout your assessment system, like many of us are doing with dispositions, and that's perfectly fine. As long as you can point to it in your narrative of how you're addressing social justice, I think ultimately you're going to be fine. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the social justice piece when we get into the standards themselves. And again, I think that's going to warrant a separate video all in of its own when we get there. But we'll talk about social justice here in a little bit. But that's kind of the assessment 6. And then we get into assessment 7 and 8, and these are the wild cards. I'm always a little bit taken aback when we review programs and a program only submits 6 assessments. When you have 7 and 8 as freebies to submit, why wouldn't you? It makes me think in your entire English program you only have 6 assessments, so you're only reporting 6. If you have more than 6, put 2 more into 7 and 8. It's not like we're going to get to 7 and you've been recognized and then we read your assessment 7 and we go, oh, no, we're pulling your recognition away because of that assessment 7. It doesn't work that way. If you're recognized through the first 6, it doesn't matter what you put in 7 and 8. You're not going to lose recognition because 7 and 8. I have seen lots of programs, though, that fell a little bit short in the first 6 and probably would have gotten recognized with conditions because they were missing a couple of standards, but ended up picking them up in 7 and 8 when they added on those extra 2 assessments. Or if you've got an assessment that you're piloting or just developing and you would like some feedback on it, put it in the 7 and 8 slot. Again, if you're fully recognized through the first 6 assessments, even if you give us an assessment 7 and 8 that have no data, we're not going to send it back to you with a condition that you give us the data for 7 and 8 because you've already been fully recognized through the first 6 assessments. Again, we're not going to pull it back. We are going to say you want to submit some data, but we'll give you some feedback on those 2 assessments. So lots of programs use that 7 and 8 slot as a way of testing out new assessments or even an assessment that they haven't begun to administer yet, but they're thinking about it. They'll put it in the 7 and 8 slot to get some feedback from NCTE. Would this be, we saw this a lot with the portfolio, for the content portfolio. A number of programs would put it like in assessment 7 and say, we're thinking about replacing the course grades in assessment 2 with this one. They'll put it in the assessment 7 slot to get some feedback before they replaced it with the course grades, that kind of thing. So do take advantage of assessment 7 and 8. I think those are really, really important. And it does send a message to reviewers when you're given 8 assessments and you only submit 6. All right. So let's go on and talk about the new revised NCTE, and I haven't changed this yet to CAEP, but I will, CAEP standards. I'm using standard 1 here on content knowledge as simply as an example. All of the standards will follow the same protocol. So we'll just begin with standard 1, which is content knowledge. What you are going to see with each one of these standards is there is a standard with a narrative that goes along with it, a description, and then there's elements for each of the standards. Some have 2 elements, some have more than 2 elements. When we make a decision as reviewers, we are making a decision at the standard level only. So when the standards were approved, we had to decide, okay, well, what means a met versus a not met decision at the standard level? Okay, we don't make decisions at the element level, only the standard level. So the official explanation is it is a preponderance of the elements that is going to dictate whether a standard is met or not met. All right, that makes a lot of sense on paper, but in practicality, what do we mean by preponderance? And I would have programs that would come to me and I would say the same thing as writing a report. Okay, how many equals a preponderance? Give me a number. And that makes sense. Over the last 10 years, we've really been focusing on numbers, those data points. So that's kind of the thinking we have in our mind. So we got together at NCTE in Washington in November of 2014 to decide as reviewers, what do we mean by preponderance? What are we going to tell programs in terms of what are they going to be held accountable to showing that they've met the narrative at the standard level? So here is the big change that is going to occur over the next 10 years with the new set of standards. The previous set of standards, because they were very prescriptive and very detailed, we were asking for a data point for each one of those standards. You put them on a rubric, you collect data, you gave us the data, and then you had to analyze the data, give us a narrative of the analysis of the data. And basically what programs tended to say was, all of our scores are high on the data that we've reported, therefore our candidates are doing well. I mean, basically that's what was being said. That's not really useful. And even from a program reviewer's perspective, looking at numbers doesn't tell me a whole lot about your program. I can see that you're in compliance, but I really didn't get a sense, looking at these reports quite often, of what's going on in the program. And programs would call me if they got a not recognized decision, and we'd have a conversation about their program, and they start telling me about all these wonderful things that they're doing in their programs that weren't necessarily reflected in numbers. The numbers didn't tell the story. But when a program coordinator started telling me about their programs, all of a sudden it began to come to life. So we began to think, as English content folks, we tend to gravitate more towards narrative and telling a story and the richness of our programs more than just numbers are going to be able to dictate. So the shift is going to be one in which prior, in the old set of standards, we were focusing primarily on numbers and data, to now focusing more on what is the narrative and the analysis and the programs being able to tell us their story. So in that context, here's how we're going to review these standards. You are still held accountable to data. All right, so in other words, you still have to have rubrics for all of your assessments, and you have to give us the data from those rubrics. But what do the rubrics need to represent? As opposed to the old set of standards where you took all of the standards and you embedded them into the rubrics, the rubrics need to demonstrate the standard level only. So in other words, the data that you're going to submit to us has to reflect the requirements up here at the standard level. So just looking at content knowledge for standard 1. Candidates demonstrate knowledge of English language arts subject matter content that specifically includes literature, multimedia text, and the knowledge and nature of adolescents as readers. So you have 3 basic components here in which you're going to have to provide us some data points to support. You need to give us data points that show that your candidates have mastered literature. Okay. Notice here we're not breaking that literature down and giving us specific data points. You're required to give us an American Lit data point and an English Lit data point and a women as writers data point, a minorities writers data point. We're not asking for those specific data points. We're asking for some data points for the idea of literature. Notice now that praxis or state licensure tests that target literature now become an effective data point to use. Grades in literature classes now provide effective data points to demonstrate that your candidates understand literature in a broad sense. We're not asking for you necessarily to break down all of the data points into the individual types of literature. We're assuming, here's where that flexibility comes in, that if you're an accredited university, your English department is teaching American literature and English literature and minority literature and women writers and so forth, that's all there. Multimedia text is the next piece. We need to see data points on multimedia text. How do you know? Show us some proof, show us some evidence, data evidence that your candidates understand and have mastered the notion of multimedia text. And then also the nature of adolescents as readers. So give us some data points that demonstrate, how do you know as a program, because we at NCTE feel this is really important, that your candidates understand how adolescents read and interpret literature, right? So you have some flexibility in terms of what data points you're going to be looking at to make that case that they can do that. So typically if you have a course or you have assignments that deal with adolescent literacy, which we all do, and certainly state requirements are going to require that same kind of content knowledge, give us those particular data points. So those are the data points that you're going to have to provide for us. And I'm not saying you give us one data point for literature. You're going to give us multiple data points for literature. But we're going to let you define what those data points ultimately are. So you're saying that, here are this rubric that demonstrates candidates know American literature and English literature, and you define what is important in terms of the literature pieces. So that's the data that you give us. Okay. Now, here is the big shift. Under here, we're on the elements, where we have to define what a preponderance is. You don't have to give us an individual data point for each one of these pieces of each of the elements. Now, certainly if you want to do it that way and build rubrics around all of these elements, that's going to work. That'll be fine because you're showing a preponderance of evidence. But what we're suggesting might be a more effective way of doing this is to give us a narrative of these elements. Here's where the analysis comes in. So in previous iterations of these reports, we would get, very, very sparse, thin kind of analysis that really didn't say much of anything. Now, the real emphasis is going to be on the analysis part. It's going to be on the narrative. We want you to talk about, we want you to tell us our story in lieu of a little bit of the data. We're letting some of the data go. As long as you're giving us data to support the standard, we want a narrative to tell us about the elements. Right? How are you addressing these components of classic text, of contemporary text, young adult literature? Where is this demonstrated in your English education programs? Because you're giving us data up here about literature, and we're letting you define those data points. But down here, we want to see the narrative that talks about all of these kinds of things. So what this might mean, and what we're hoping this is going to mean, it's going to open up some conversations in your programs to have a discussion back over with the English department, which might be across campus, to talk about, hey, we're using these assessments, or you're giving us course grades as data points. Where in your courses are you hitting young adult literature? What are the classic texts that are being required of our teacher education candidates over in the English department, and getting that narrative? And I know as a former English professor, if you came into my office and you were asking for data points, I was a little bit lost. If you came into my office and you wanted to talk about the content of my courses, you could sit there and we could talk all afternoon. I'm happy to talk about that. And that's the effective conversation we want to have. We want you having conversations about content, not just about the data points. And with the old set of standards, where we're really focusing on that issue of data points, it was talking a lot about numbers, which quite often for English language arts folks didn't mean as much, or wasn't as helpful as having more of a content-focused discussion. So what you're going to find is your analysis section is going to be a much larger section now, because we're going to be spending the majority of our time as reviewers reading your narrative to see that you're hitting a preponderance. You don't have to talk about every single one of the components of the elements, but we want the majority of these. All right, so thinking about it, if your students are writing papers, and when we say you don't have to address all of this, but we want the preponderance, most of this, you have a pretty good idea of what that means. So down here, you're going to have this narrative, and you're going to draw on some of these data points up here to support your narrative. But it's really the narrative and the analysis that's going to be most important. So that's kind of the huge shift that we're going to see in these reports, is these reports are going to be much more narrative based, that give you the opportunities to tell us your story. And as long as you're giving us the data points to support the standard, we're not asking for lots and lots of data to support these elements. Now, certainly, as we tell our students when they're writing their reports, and they have to support their assertions, if you have data points to support your assertions, certainly include them down here in the elements. But what we're really looking for, and this is kind of the phrase that came out of our discussion with the reviewers, is we want to see programs telling us their stories and supporting that, but really focusing on the narrative more than just data chart after data chart after data chart. All right, and this is going to follow through with all of the standards. So we have the content knowledge standard, which we've talked about, and then we go down to standard 2, which is also content knowledge, and notice that this is parallel to standard 1, which talked about literature. Now this one is talking about candidates demonstrate knowledge of English language arts subject matter content that specifically includes language and writing. So this is a parallel standard. So standard 1 is talking about literature, standard 2 is talking about composition. And you'll do it the same way. So you provide us the data point at the standard level up here, and then you provide us the narrative explanation that talks about the richness of your program in addressing all of these elements, and that becomes the narrative component. Right? and then we will just briefly go through the rest of these standards the same way. So, standard 3, candidates plan instruction and design assessments for reading and the study of literature. So here now in standard 1 we've talked about they understand literature and the content of literature. In standard 3 they can plan instruction for literature. So you see how everything is kind of paralleled. Then you get, what do you think standard 4 is going to be? Absolutely, standard 4 is talking about planning instruction and designing assessments for composing text. So now we're to the writing. So standard 2 was about the content of writing, and now standard 4 is about the pedagogy of writing. And again, you will give us data to support the standard, which is, it tends to be very, very broad. And again, we're not asking for one data point for the standard. We're looking for multiple data points, but we're allowing you to define what those data points are that demonstrate that candidates have mastered the standard. And then where you worry about all of the detail of this element is in the narrative analysis. You talk about the elements. All right. And then we get down to 5 on self-reflection. And then the one that I really want to focus on is on 6. Candidates demonstrate knowledge of how theories and research about social justice, diversity, equity, student identities, and schools as institutions can enhance students' opportunities to learn in English language arts. This is the quote-unquote social justice standard. This is the new one. This is the curveball in many ways that I think if you look at all of those other standards and the elements, you're going to find all of that reflected in the old set of standards. So I don't think you're going to have to do major revisions to the assessments that you already have. It's more in the reporting of those particular assessments that's going to change a little bit, and you're going to have to tweak maybe some of the language on the rubrics, maybe, to collect data points for the individual standards. But I don't see major revisions to the assessment system in your programs really happening. That's the good news. And again, why we're doing this video, because the reporting is going to be quite a bit different. But standard 6 is the anomaly here. This is the one that is completely and totally different. And there's been lots of discussions at NCTE. There is a couple committees at NCTE that are looking at the notions of social justice. At NCTE in 2014, there was a couple of presentations on the issues of social justice. In 2015 in Minnesota, there's going to be another panel, and I'll be on that panel as well, talking about social justice. And hopefully at that time, we'll have some model assessments that we can share with you and so forth. So as reviewers, what are we holding you accountable to in terms of the social justice standard? We're holding you accountable to making a strong effort to embed social justice within your assessment system. And here is where you can use that old disposition assessment and use that slot to try to come up within your program and have a conversation of how are we going to assess the notion of social justice within our program. As long as at least for now, for the first couple cycles of the requirement of these new standards, as long as you are making those efforts to execute assessments within your program that are addressing social justice as best you can, you're going to ultimately meet this standard. Where it's going to be a problem is if you don't address social justice at all within your program report, then the standard 6 is going to be not met. All right, so we want you to address it in whatever ways as best you can. In other words, we're not putting a scale necessarily on social justice. We want to see that you're assessing it and that you're trying to collect some data on the notion of social justice with at the same time understanding that we're not exactly sure how this is going to be measured or assessed. So we're holding you accountable to the notion of social justice within your programs and talking about that in terms of having a reliable and valid assessment piece in place. We're not holding you accountable at to that level yet. All right. So we want you addressing Standard 6, social justice within your programs, doing the best you can in terms of assessment and collecting data, but at the same time understanding that we have to be a little bit flexible in regards to how far along this process you ultimately are. Now, in the next year or so, when we begin to get assessments from programs, some model assessments to begin to share, then the accountability is going to get ramped up a little bit. But for right now, we want you experimenting and doing the best you can with this notion of social justice. And hopefully this will open up a conversation across NCT to having a discussion about what social justice ultimately is and how to effectively assess it within your systems. All right. So I look forward to see where that one ultimately is going to go. And then assessment 7, again, it's following the same format. You're collecting data at the standard level and you're providing a narrative for the particular elements. And so this use of assessment results, this is going to become really important. This is going to be a much larger part of the program report than it has been in the past. So what we are expecting to see here as reviewers, what we're looking for is an extended narrative and analysis of assessment data collected at the standard level, okay, that very broad standard level. And don't confuse me, I'm not saying give us one data point for each standard. There needs to be multiple data points for those standards, but we're letting you define what those data points need to be, as opposed to the old set of standards where each of the standards represented its own data point. So we want to give you that flexibility. So we're still holding you accountable to data, but we're giving you the flexibility to define to a certain degree what that data what those data points ultimately are. And then providing an opportunity to describe the program's evaluation system and application of assessment results for program improvement. So really looking at those elements and giving us the rich story, the narrative behind what the data is telling us. This is the conversation that I think was missing in so many of the old program reports, where we were assuming that the data points would tell the story, and it really wasn't happening in an effective way. I think it was there as a compliance measure, but we weren't getting the sense reading the report of the richness of the program itself. And then when it comes to the decision making, it is required that all standards have a decision, that there is a general evaluation of the program report evidence based on each of the assessments in Part C of the program report. So this is for the reviewers. So what the reviewers are going to do is they're going to talk about in the report you get back in C1, C2, C3, just like in the old reports, they're going to be talking about the assessments that you've provided reliable and valid assessments, and that you have provided data points that reflect the expectation of the standard. But there must also be an evaluation of the use of the assessment results, and this is Part D. Remember, assessment analysis narratives are where programs will demonstrate a preponderance of evidence regarding the elements of each standard. This is the language for the program reviewer. So we're going to be looking at that Part D to really talk about the particular elements of each one of the standards. Now, the reporting mechanism is going to be a little bit awkward in the sense that we're using kind of the old template for reporting as opposed to something that's more narrative based. And one of the things that we would like to do in the next cycle or two, and I'd like to really have a draft out here in the next couple of months, of a new report form that you can use, in which instead of responding and providing a narrative for each assessment, really providing a narrative for each standard. So under each standard, you would talk about how you are addressing those particular elements. And that, again, hopefully will be coming out shortly, and you can see what the draft of that might look like. And it may make the reporting a little bit more disjointed, because typically now what you're doing is you're providing an assessment and then you're providing an analysis of that assessment. So your narrative would go along with it. And it can be kind of difficult to connect assessments 1, 2, and 3 together to show a broader picture. But I think that's down the road just a little bit. And then the decision making, whether a standard is going to be met, not met, or met with conditions. Programs are required to provide data at the standard level only. This determines whether a standard is going to be met or not met. So if you provide us data points and you explain how those data points demonstrate the expectation at the standard level, that is going to be met or not met. So if you haven't given us data points that demonstrate candidates' mastery of the components of the standard, then it's going to be not met. If you provide us data points and an explanation of how those data points reflect the expectation at the standard, then it's going to be met. All right? Whether it's met with conditions or not is going to be based on the narrative analysis, because this is a completely new expectation. So in other words, if you provide us the narrative in which you're telling us the story, but you only talk about maybe one or two of the components of the elements, and we don't feel that you're really hitting the preponderance of those components of the elements, then we're not going to say you're not, the standard is not met, because you have given us the data. But we are going to come back with conditions, just like we would with our students, say you need to revise the narrative a little bit, and you need to talk a little bit more about, let's say, classic literature. You know, if we go back to that first standard that we looked at, where it talked about one of the elements was classic text, but you haven't in your narrative addressed classic text at all, that might be one that we would come back and say, you haven't spoken at all about classic text within your English language arts program. Can you expand upon that narrative a little bit? And that doesn't mean then that you have to go back and give the assessments again to collect more data. It just means now you can go back and you can expand that narrative a little bit and then just resubmit based on the narrative. So it becomes more of like give and take that we sometimes have with our students as they develop and expand their essays to really develop those details. But that would be a conditions, that would not be withholding a recognition from your particular program. And that's going to be the new review process. That's how it's going to work. So the emphasis becomes much more on you having the opportunity to tell us your story. We're holding you accountable to the data. It's there. That's fine. That's going to meet the standard, and in a very broad way, which is great. But we also want to see those details, and that is going to come out of the richness of narrative ultimately, that you're telling us your story about your program. So for us, it becomes a lot more reading of narrative, which is great, because now we begin to understand your program, and it becomes less about having to look at numbers and try to figure out what those numbers mean. Because quite often it was difficult for us to understand what the numbers meant, and I'm sure as program reviewers, and I teach in a program as well, just looking at numbers doesn't tell the whole story. That becomes a little bit difficult. So we think this new review process is going to be very helpful to you as programs, because it's giving you that flexibility. You also have an understanding of what the expectation is, that it's a more practical and reasonable and I think productive expectation of what the program review process is supposed to be about. And it's not just about the coldness of numbers, because the numbers are there, and we're still required to submit those numbers. I mean, there still is that expectation and that rigor of good solid assessments with rubrics and data collection, because you are making a data-driven decision. But we want to see more of the discussion that goes along with it, and that's part of that analysis. So this has been just the brief overview of the new standards that are going to take us through the next 10 years, and this is the first in the video series. We will come back with additional videos here shortly, one specifically that's going to talk about individual assessments, and we're going to put up on both the CAEP and the NCTE website example assessments, along with another webinar to go through those assessments, so we see what a good content reporting of an assessment 1, an assessment 2, an assessment 3, and so forth. There'll be an additional web video talking about the social justice standard. That might be a bit down the road as we begin to see more social justice assessments coming in, and those will be put up on the website. And then hopefully at some point there'll be a question and answer forum that we can put up on the NCT website, where we can begin to share ideas across programs and have more of a national conversation about developing good English language arts teachers. So I hope this first video has been helpful. I've been trying to work without a script, so I hope it's been coherent to everybody. You have my contact information, And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate contacting me. And I look forward to future chats in the future. And take care. Bye-bye.